Hi again. Welcome to Utopia. Actually, Utah would be closer to an actual utopia if we could clean up the air in the Salt Lake Valley. Anyone who visits or lives along the Wasatch Front knows that we have some of the worst air quality in the entire country. We will chronicle efforts to change this fact, and today we share a recent study being conducted by NOAA and the Utah Department of Health to collect samples and determine sources of the worst types of pollution. Here's Shawn King with this week's feature story.
Lungs matter! Black lungs matter! Black lungs matter! Can Utah have clean air? Yes, we can! Can Utah run on clean energy? Yes, we can! Can we have a clean future? Yes, we can! Can we make the legislature do their job?
If we want policy that will actually clean up our air, we actually have to have a government and a political atmosphere that's going to be an asset rather than a liability. And I think it's fair to say that every single day that we live along the Wasatch Front, politics interferes with that. The Utah legislature needs to help a lot more than they have. There's no question about that. It's interesting that when we first formed our organization about 10 years ago, we had some very lengthy discussions with legislators and former legislators. And we asked them, what would be an effective political strategy to try and shape public policy in the direction that we think it needs to go? And it's interesting what they said. They said, you would be better off spending your time trying to reach out to the public directly rather than to our lawmakers. One of the most basic tasks of any government to solve this problem is to know what kind of a problem we're dealing with. And so monitoring our air quality is central to that.
Currently, Salt Lake City ranked 7th to last in terms of short-term particle pollution out of all cities in the United States and was awarded an F by the American Lung Association. It got so bad that the United States EPA declared that 3 regions in northern Utah, including Salt Lake Valley, are in non-attainment for PM 2.5 and fell below national ambient air quality standards on average 18 days per year. That meant that the state of Utah was now required by law to develop a plan to improve air quality.
I've seen dirty air in different places. Salt Lake City region, when it's bad, is as bad as any place that I've seen.
Stephen Brown, esteemed scientist for the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, or NOAA, recently visited Salt Lake City for an extended stay. He brought his research staff, an airplane, and a lot of cool-looking instruments. This PhD was on loan from the NOAA laboratory in Boulder, Colorado. His specialty? Atmospheric chemistry.
And that's really the main motivation for being here. Can we make an observation that tells you that a certain policy will be more effective or less effective, which will in turn help people who have to make those decisions decide what's most cost effective or least cost effective to actually implement.
The impetus for the recruitment of Dr. Stephen Brown and his team can be traced to a local scientist who has dedicated much of her recent career to improving local air quality.
My name is Monk Bayar Basındorç. I go by Monk. I'm an environmental scientist with Utah Division of Air Quality and research professor with the University of Utah.
The data collection would last 1 month. Called the Utah Winter Fine Particulate Study, the goal? to better understand the factors that contribute to particulate matter pollution in northern Utah.
In order to come up with an effective strategy to mitigate those kinds of air pollution issues, the state needs to understand how that air pollution gets there. And that requires a detailed understanding both of the meteorology as well as the chemistry that affects a particular region. So we're here to try to provide that understanding that will then feed into what the state decides to do to address its air quality issues.
By air and by land, this was the unique feature of this new study. Much work has been done and is currently being conducted by the EPA, DEQ, BYU, the University of Utah, and USU on land. But this study was unique. Stephen Brown and his team would collect information from an airplane, while Monk and her team from the EPA and universities would collect data from 5 strategically placed locations across the Wasatch Front.
We do know that, in fact, the actual particulate formation probably happens higher up, and then there's mixing involved that brings the particulate-rich air down to the surface, and that's when we get exposed to particulate matter. So it's just, again, one of the complexities of this problem. And if we didn't have an aircraft and other sophisticated tools, again, we would not be able to get to that point. Yeah.
A lot of the atmospheric chemistry that matters for understanding this region is occurring in the 1,000 or 2,000 foot altitude range much more rapidly than it is at the surface. So that's why we need to have an airplane here. We need to understand what the difference is between the surface and the air aloft. The air samples themselves are drawn from outside of the airplane to the inside. The instruments measure the composition of that air in real time with a time resolution of about 1 second. That's important because we are flying at 100 miles an hour, which is 60 meters per second. So every 1 second air sample is going to be something like 60 meters or 200 feet of spatial resolution. And we need that kind of spatial resolution to know what's going on.
The 3-hour flights cover the entire region, from as far north as the Idaho border, south through the Utah Valley to Provo. The plane repeatedly traverses Salt Lake City and across the Great Salt Lake. The crew flies 2 3-hour missions each day they venture out.
Our flight patterns always include airfields across the region. And every time we come over an airfield, we'll do what's called a missed approach. So the airplane descends, gets within about 15 feet of the runway, pulls out of the landing, and then we'll ascend all the way until we get up above the top of the pollution layer until it gets clean again. And then we've seen how things change from the surface to the top.
Meanwhile, back on land, 5 sites were established along the Wasatch Front collecting ground-level air quality data. 2 sites in Cache Valley and 1 in Smithfield, which would measure rural areas. 2 sites in Salt Lake City, 1 at Hawthorne Elementary, and another site at the University of Utah, and a 5th site in Linden, Utah. These sites draw a continuous flow of air through high-end filters to hypersensitive sensors and record the chemical composition of the surrounding atmosphere.
Stay tuned for more Utopia after these messages.